So this is a little something that was, in a way, last minute, because it just so happened that Peter Fonda's death just happened to be really close to when there was a lot of anniversary screenings going on for Easy Rider, as it was. And so I was kind of thinking, well, we haven't really talked about it yet, so I probably, should at some point. And then when this happened, I figured it would be more like basically what I did with Burt Reynolds when we talked about Smoking the Bandit and Cannonball Run, where it's like, I don't really call it like a tribute video or anything, but I figure it's a good opportunity to talk about some of the stuff they've done, which is why I chose The Wild Angels along with Easy Rider, because there was obviously more comparable stuff like The Wild One or Hell's Angels on Wheels or something, but I figured we'd stick to the whole Fonda thing and go with The Wild Angels, which is a movie that's always kind of stuck with me anyway, so this is kind of my opportunity to put that out there. Also worth noting, obviously The Wild Angels was by Roger Corman, and Roger Corman actually, to my understanding, turned this movie down, to which he said is like the worst decision he ever made. And I imagine it would have been a totally different movie. Instead, we got the one through Dennis Hopper's perspective. So I figure we'll go ahead and start with Easy Rider before we go into anything else. And there's obviously not much to say right off that hasn't already been said. Obviously, it was released at just the right time where, like, the whole counterculture thing was really going off, and there was a whole rebellion going on top of stuff like Woodstock was just getting ready to happen. And so it just kind of came out at exactly the perfect time, and it's one of those things where it's one of those movies where there's different types of timeless. When you look at movies, where when you think of timeless, you sort of think of movies that still have like constantly relevant things in them throughout, and like you can watch it today and like things will resonate just as much, and you can sort of make comparisons. But then there's also the kind of timeless to where it's really a product of its time, yet at the same time never really feels like when you watch it, it doesn't feel dated. It just takes you back to that time. You know what I mean? And I feel like Easy Rider is kind of one of the prime examples of that, if not the prime example of that. Especially with the way that it tells the story in general, where you talk about the whole sort of counterculture thing that was going on. And there was even when the headline that I saw that came out that announced Fonda's death actually called him like a sort of icon of counterculture because of Easy Rider and some of the movies he made around that time. But not only was it just sort of that symbolic of that sort of in general, but the way it sort of went against the way movies were made also. It just kind of became this whole sort of different thing that movies have since sort of found inspiration in. But that's not to say that it didn't also find inspiration in a lot of stuff as well. When you think about the way the music is used and how a lot of this, apparently it was like 3 hours or something before Hopper decided that it didn't really need like a whole bunch of history on the characters or some sort of specific storyline or anything. If anything, that almost would go against what the feel of the movie ultimately is and what it seems to be going for and saying about its characters and just that whole sort of era in general. But the way he also... There's a lot of long stretches where there's no dialogue, and the music sort of speaks to it. And there is a lot of movies... Like, it's actually, like, extremely common for movies to kind of evoke their emotions through pre-existing songs. Like, not even a score. And I think this event actually came down to the fact that they couldn't afford a score. So Albert was like, we'll just use pre-existing songs, of the era, and we'll set the tones that way. Which is something that sort of took off. Like, it's obviously probably the main director you associate that with now is Scorsese, or to an extent James Gunn, somebody like that. But as far as in this particular era, Scorsese was right there on the cusp of happening, in a big way. So you look at the inspirations of what Hopper took to make this, or Scorsese did with his movies, and you look at a movie called Scorpio Rising from, I think, 1963 by a director named Kenneth Anger, which is a movie that's only about like a half an hour long, but is basically, that movie is basically the reason that we have like soundtracks the way we do now. Soundtracks of pre-existing songs that find their way into pre-existing movies. I did, for some reason, I totally blanked saying Tarantino in that list as well. But yeah, so obviously become this very common thing. And this movie is also... We'll talk more about Scorpio Rising when we get to The Wild Angels, because this was not the only movie we're going to talk about that was inspired by it. But it's also just the sort of... this movie feels almost so in tune with, like, you know, music and pre-existing songs and all that, that the guy they sell the cocaine to that sets the whole thing off and gives them the money to do what they do throughout the movie is Phil Spector, of all people. And I feel like there's a couple of reasons that's not an accident, or not just something totally random. But going into this also, we talk about what all Hopper did when making this movie and how it sort of, you know... I don't know if it's broke down barriers, but sort of showed new paths in which you could make movies and the stories in which you could tell and how you could tell them. And like I said, the way it just totally seemingly went against Hollywood in itself in regards to how they made movies, because not only do you have the music where in any time before this, or even before Scorpio Rising, I guess you could say, it was like, you know, mainly music scores, and if there was a song with like lyrics in it, it was probably a musical number. And at this time, it was still... Because obviously there was 6 years between this and Scorpio Rising, and The Wild Angels had happened in between them, and a few others in between. But for the most part, when Easy Rider came around, it was still kind of uncommon. And still kind of felt like this really new and fresh thing. So then you go on that, you go on the whole idea of that speaking, those songs and speaking for the movie, and the scenery and the imagery speaking for the movie, kind of going it without, you know, going those long stretches without dialogue and stuff like that. And then just the ending itself is very anti the ending you were sort of expecting in movies at this time. Bonnie and Clyde had only been a couple of years before, but still, just within this era, all this stuff was sort of taking off. And Easy Rider is definitely one of the prime examples of all of the stuff we're talking about here. Also to the point that, as far as the lack of dialogue, there's a whole lot of confusion about the script. And how it's like Hopper, I guess Hopper once claimed that a lot of it was him, and then Tara Sutherland, who is the co-writer with Hopper and Fonda, says it was mostly them. Then I heard they hardly used the script at all. A lot of the stuff, like Nicholson's stuff, was ad-libbed, but then I've heard a lot of it was really carefully scripted. It's really hard to say, but regardless, the movie did get 2 Oscar nominations, one of which being Nicholson's performance, the other being the script. So, with Hopper, Fonda, and Sutherland all getting nominated. So, regardless, all of their contributions are in there somewhere, which is the important thing. And even when you look at stuff like the unconventional edit, like the unconventional transitions, like the shots we see where one scene starts and then it bleeds into another scene by having it cut back and forth from the last frame of this shot to the first frame of the incoming shot, is something that you still haven't really seen since. Unless somebody was either trying to be super artsy, or just flat out copying what Hopper was doing here. But going on that also, this is what a large portion of the movie is for a while. It's just the music and the imagery, and occasionally smoking weed around a campfire. And the effects of that, whether it be Hopper sort of laughing to himself, or Fonda getting all philosophical on us. And that's kind of the closest we get to the movie flat out stating what its points are, and most of the time you kind of see symbolism in the imagery, or sort of, you know, foreboding stuff, foreshadowing, stuff like that. And then every now and then Fonda will say something that's just sort of almost like the bottom line of all the stuff we've seen prior to them, and then repeat. And then we go through the whole Nicholson thing, then they smoke weed, Fonda will say something profound, and then we move on again. And that's all it is it's just like one of the ultimate road movies, where when you're on the road, you just go from place to place, whatever happens at one stopping point happens, and you go on to the next, and that's the journey in itself. And the movie is able to set that up and feel like you were on this journey, but condensing it into an hour and a half, yet getting sort of the full impact. There's some scenes I used to have issues with when I was younger. Like, I felt like they were on the hippie commune a little too long. I guess I still kind of somewhat feel that way when I watch it now, but I also kind of appreciate just sort of the journey itself, the more I watch it, and the sort of as I age with it, I guess. But then there's the moment where the movie does take a significant turning point, where even if you just really love and just really take in everything prior to it, even you can admit that there's definitely a turning point where the movie really gets amped up when Nicholson is introduced. When they go into the when they go into the jail, getting arrested for the stupidest reason by just finding their way into a parade and parading without a permit. Which of course is just one of those things where the fate that sets you on a certain path is usually just the dumbest, most random thing that you wouldn't predict. And sure enough, this sends them on a whole other journey, going off with Hanson, who's the lawyer they meet that gets them out and goes along with them. With his football helmet in tow and everything, giving it the movie's easily most famous shot. Once again, that's another one of those cases where you see Nicholson on the back of Fonda's bike with his football helmet waving like an idiot, and anybody, even who hasn't seen the movie, can tell you what movie that is. And then, as Nicholson goes into this movie, we've got the scenes where they sit around the campfire and they smoke weed again, but this time with the added inclusion of Hanson's insight on stuff like aliens, and the fact that they may live among us. And the way that he talks about this, and we believe that he believes it so much, like the way he describes the aliens and how they live among us, it's like the way he speaks is so matter-of-fact, it's like somebody explaining something they know so well, like their job. It's like he might as well just be explaining the ins and outs of his job to us in the exact same tone that he's saying, you know, aliens are, you know, here, and, you know, those UFOs you're seeing, there's, like, a lot of them, and they're real, you're not just hallucinating, and and all that. And that's really the beauty of what Nicholson's able to bring here, Nicholson has always had this way, and of course this is the movie where he, like, really, really took off. It was his first Oscar nomination out of a billion, like 13, I think it is. And we see in this performance what we would see, and he had some stuff before this where you could see this also, but it really took off here, and then Five Easy Pieces was just the very next year, and then it's really sort of became his thing, where it's like, the way Nicholson's able to combine naturalism and theatricality, like, all at the same time, or sometimes in the way he does one thing, but then he'll do another in a totally different way. Where it's like the way he speaks so naturally when he's talking about this and when he's getting high for the first time. But then we've just got the theatrics, like the thing he does whenever he takes a drink, which apparently is something he got from, like, a friend that did that or something. And so, and just little details like that. The way he enunciates when he's talking about the House of Blue Lights and the way he's describing it. Just pretty much every fraction of George in this movie is gold. And it's one of those cases where he is missed when he's gone, but I also like that it sort of sticks with the tone, because you hear about, you see, like, his death and how abruptly it happens. But maybe not so abruptly, because we have the whole scene where it starts off when they're at the diner. And we sort of see, like, the two different sides of this era of rebellion going on, between the way the guys in the one booth react to them versus the way the girls react to them. And it's like we keep cutting back and forth between the two, and the guys are saying, like, you know, they're really defensive, and they're saying, like, oh, they represent this, and they're evil, and they need a haircut and all that. And then you've got the girls who are, like, see that as, like, you know, the different path to go down, the part where, like, they feel so repressed on this side, this is their way to do something totally different, and just totally rebel against everything, whether it be the man or society or whatever the fuck. And I really like the way that sort of shows both sides of that in this one moment, and the impact that they had regardless. But the other thing that sort of makes it feel a little less abrupt is sort of the foreshadowing with George. The first one, maybe I'm reaching here, but the first bit of foreshadowing that gets me every time I watch this is the first thing we hear George doing when he wakes up in jail is complaining about his head, and then he has a headache, that his head hurts. And it's like, oh, that's not foreboding at all when you know what happens to him. But then there's the scene also when he, it's right after they've been to the diner, and they're sitting around the campfire again, and he's talking about how, like, you know, it's hard to be free when you're bought and sold in the marketplace and all that, and he's saying how they think they're one thing when they're actually the total opposite of it, and it's seeing people like them, seeing them in the diner or anywhere, seeing them out on their bikes or whatever, makes them come to the realization that maybe they're not the free ones they think they are, and that's why they get so aggressive and defensive as they see them and realize that's what they think they are and they're not. And then he caps it off by saying it makes them dangerous. Basically predicting not only his own death, but also theirs, eventually. So that's one of those things where, like, the dialogue feels so natural, and so everything just flows so nicely until you realize just how really, foreboding the foreshadowing is, and the points that they're making that are eventually heading them down this dark path that they don't quite see coming yet, even if all the clues are there. And George is the only one that seems to see it coming, even if number one, he's high at the time, and number two, he suffers this fate very shortly after that night, maybe like an hour or so later. But then, like I said, once that happens, they don't dwell on it. They just keep up with the idea of, well, we've got to keep moving. Well, do we send this stuff to his family? Do we take this stuff and use it for ourselves? Whatever, we just got to move along. And then we get to the point where they go to the House of Blue Lights, and they use the acid they got from that hitchhiker from the hippie commune, and have a really, really bad trip. And this is when, and the beauty about this scene also, it's one of those cases where this is the kind of mindset that Dennis Hopper was in when he directed this movie. So you can, even somebody who's like never done any type of drug, you're just like, I'm going to trust that this is an accurate representation of what that's probably like. Particularly the whole bad trip thing, where it's almost, you tend to wonder, because they make a big deal out of the hitchhiker saying, like, this is to have when you're at the right place with the right people. And it's almost like it's saying that they got too eager. Or they jumped the gun on, is this the right place, are these the right people? Apparently not the right place, apparently not the right people, given what happens. When they end up in the cemetery, and things get really crazy for about 5 minutes, to the point that, I guess Hopper wanted to go so extreme that he had the whole monologue that Fonda has, where we even hear him say, like, mother, when he's at the statue, and Hopper wanted him to basically be talking to his mother, who had killed herself when Fonda was 10 years old in real life. And I guess Fonda was like kind of against that idea and thought it was a little extreme, but somehow Hopper eventually got him to that point, and that's what's on camera, and you can kind of sense just the sort of rawness of the whole thing, and just how it goes as deep into this, horribly bad trip as it possibly can, just for us to come out on the other side and keep moving along again. Only for us to eventually reach their ultimate fate, where there is the whole sort of, there's many ways this ending has been interpreted. I'm willing to accept, I haven't heard an interpretation of this ending I'm not willing to accept, because there is the whole thing about, so the one that I think rings true for me the most is actually something that a critic said, I think maybe around the time it came out, but it was something along the lines of, and because you see this so much today too, where it's like, when you feel so, brought down by, like, the direction that, everything's going like the establishment or whatever, and people feel overwhelmed by it, that it almost becomes the cool thing to do, to say that everything's helpless, and you can't do anything about it, so I'm just going to watch the world burn. It's a very sort of, edgy teenager way of looking at it. But given the era that this was in, and the way those people, the young people that were rebelling, it kind of makes perfect sense that would be the outlook of, it's an ending that's just saying, it's helpless anyway, what's it all matter? Hence them getting blown away by the pickup truck rednecks, I guess. And then there's the whole thing about, like, is this what happens when you try to, be your own person or be free or whatever? You're always going to be put down by something. But then there's the whole thing of, I've seen variations where it's said that they see Billy and Wyatt as sellouts, because they, kind of did their own thing and they were doing that, and then the movie begins and they're able to take this journey by making money, and giving money to the establishment, which would also, it's another interpretation of the casting of Phil Spector in that part. But in his Rolls Royce and everything. But, yeah, and then it's like, so is that, you know, the punishment for them selling out? I think I take more of the whole with sort of the rebellious thing of the way their mindset was at the time, and like I said, you see it a lot now, where a lot of people, particularly young people, want to just give up in the, you know, when they see that direction, when they see it, they might be overpowered instead of doing something about it, or, you know, fighting to live to be the person they want to be, or as free as they want to be. They just say it's too much, and, you know, and they just surrender is what they do. So, yeah, well, like I said, there you can take that in so many different ways. I know there was another ending that involved more of them sort of going off into the sunset, and Hopper, like, really had to decide to, and, like, it wasn't one of those things where Hopper really wanted the bleak ending, and a studio or whatever was saying, oh, we want the happy ending. Hopper actually himself had trouble deciding between the two. Ultimately deciding for the more bleak one, which, as we've seen, is another thing where more and more as movies go on, the bleak ending has become, for quite some time now, has been the more popular way to go, where people are sort of anti the happy ending, mainly because of its the happy ending's, you know, distance from real life. Because people really want the real life thing more and more in their movies nowadays, and it almost seems like kind of a precursor to that. Like I said, that, if you include Bonnie and Clyde from a couple years or before this, all kind of coming together for this era, going in that direction. So, yeah, so that's pretty much how I see Easy Rider. So, yeah, it's one of those movies that I do sort of... I've watched it... I haven't watched it like a billion times, but I've watched it a lot, like, every couple of years, so it's like every time I watch it there's been a big gap since the last time, and there are portions of it that feel like a new and different movie the older I get, and the way it sort of either gets farther away from today's reality, or in some cases not closer to it, but you can see a resemblance in something in regards to what this movie was reacting to, or as a response to, or whatever. So that's how I feel about it. So, going on to the Wild Angels, the first thing I should probably mention about the Wild Angels, actually, is it's one of those movies that seems to have a lot of problems with people having trouble determining whose side we're supposed to be on. And it's like, is it glorifying that whole thing? Because there is the whole Hells Angels thing, where I can't have a concrete opinion on this because there's too many, this person says one thing, this person says another thing. Because there's the whole association of the Hells Angels being like this sort of criminal organization. Or a bunch of bad people doing bad things or whatever, and like drugs and prostitution and all that stuff. But then you have, you know, like, members of the Hells Angels saying, like, no, that's not the whole organization. That's particular people that have been in the organization. It's not what the thing stands for. We do charitable stuff. We do all that other stuff. We organize all this. There's just so much back and forth. I don't know. But the point I'm making with this is that if you go into a Roger Corman movie expecting any sort of realistic depiction of anything resembling reality, you're not only in the wrong place, you clearly don't know who Roger Corman is, or have seen any of his movies whatsoever. Though, mind you, this did mark sort of evolution in his filmography that we'll talk about towards the end, but in the meantime, yeah, so obviously you watch the movie, and you see, like, when the title of the movie comes up, there's a swastika in the title. And so there's this whole debate, I guess, of does the movie glorify them, or is the movie showing us how terrible they are, and it's like a cautionary tale or something. So, yeah, I don't know. So, like, it's, like, there's the debate of, is it saying, oh, if you know, join a biker gang, you get to be, you know, Heavenly Blues, you'll get to be the head of this whole gang, you'll get to be the fearless leader, the one that everybody follows and everybody loves. Or you could also do this and you can end up like Loser, and you can be fucking dead. It's but like I said, I don't think this movie, because I know you see some of the comments on this movie and they're like, oh, this is a terrible depiction. It's like, oh, that's not part of the culture. They don't do this sort of thing. Oh, bikes don't do whatever the hell. But it's like, this is not a movie set in reality. And these characters are not characters that are set in reality. There are people in real life that will do the things these characters do, for sure. But bottom line, I don't think the movie's glorifying anything. It can maybe seem that way at the start, where it's like, where we have this opening scene where we see the kid on like a tricycle or something. And then just as he comes into the frame, Fonda pulls up on his bike. And so I always kind of took that opening as like sort of talking about the biker lifestyle in general, where it's like, when we're all children, all of us, we start on bikes. We start on a tricycle or work our way up to a regular bike or whatever. All children own a bike, ride a bike, do all that. And then it's just a matter of if you stay on the bike as you get older and which direction that goes, and you can start from here where this kid is on the tricycle and end up right here next to him where Fonda is now. And so that could be a way of seeing it as like this sort of, collision of, past and future selves or whatever, which could seem like maybe a bit of a glorification, almost making like a nostalgic thing out of it. But then it is quickly after that we get the opening credits sequence. He goes and he picks up Bruce Dern, and then they start doing the horrible shit that they do. And we start realizing just the horrible, terrible people that these people are in this very bleak movie about people who think violence is the answer to everything and rape is a reflex. So, like I said, I don't see much of a glorification here. And there was the whole thing where the real Hells Angels, despite, being extras in the movie, actually filed a $5 million defamation suit because of the way they were portrayed in the movie. So that you can throw that into the debate as well, in regards to whether or not it goes in that direction or not. But as far as the movie itself goes, when you watch the opening credits, you'll notice a couple of interesting things here, being the inclusion of Peter Bogdanovich, who would go on just 5 years later and do The Last Picture Show and really break out as this magnificent director. In, I think, '68, he did a movie called Targets with Boris Karloff, which is incredible. One of the most suspenseful movies ever made. I cannot recommend that enough. But he's credited here as an assistant. But apparently he did some uncredited writing, and he did uncredited cinematography. So to think that somebody had a hand in this also that would go on to do the things that they do and become such a name synonymous with the industry, started in movies like this with Corman. There is something here. And so going on that, I bring Scorpio Rising back into it. Where, once again, this movie has a lot really borrows a lot from, because I talked about Scorpio Rising not only being a movie that introduced, kind of having soundtracks and pre-existing songs in movies, but also there's like a whole, like, well, the thing about that is another short art movie that comes into play here that was also in this era, I think it was 1965, so it would have been the year before this, is Andy Warhol's Vinyl, which is like an adaptation pre-Kubrick of A Clockwork Orange. And the thing about it is the camera just sits in one place while it happens, and everything just kind of happens either in the foreground or the background. It's in black and white and everything. But even so, watching the opening scenes in this, where everybody's sort of fighting each other and they're causing chaos, I kind of had flashbacks to Vinyl on top of that. So when you look at Vinyl and Scorpio Rising, one thing those two have in common is the homoeroticism thing. And whereas, especially now, everybody seems to want to work homoeroticism into everything. So I want to make it abundantly clear, I don't think either of these movies really does that. Like Easy Rider or The Wild Angels. But both these movies, I feel, really played a part in how The Wild Angels sort of came to be. So the fact that this is a B movie that is inspired by art films, and sort of experimental filmmaking in general, is such an interesting combination. It's really kind of given this movie like this second life in European film festivals, which I find really interesting. because, yeah, when you look at it, it just does seem like another Corman B movie. And in that biker genre that was sort of short-lived in this era. Like I said, they did start to get more prestigious with, like, Easy Rider and The Wild One and stuff like that, but, this one in particular does feel very sort of... There's something sort of grimy and almost underground about it. And I think that's where a lot of its appeal comes from. Or like I said, once again, I can't stress this enough, not set in any reality I'm particularly aware of, except Corman's mind. So you have this introduction also where it's, I've seen people refer to this movie as the prequel to Laura Dern, with that being the apparently common known fact that Bruce Dern and Diane Ladd, who are Laura Dern's parents, apparently conceived her while they were making this movie together, and they play each other's sort of love interest, I guess you could say. And I use the term, you know, lightly, of course, in a movie like this. And you can sort of see in a lot of Diane Ladd's performance, like future Laura Dern performances, it's really kind of eerie when you watch her here. And there's also a pre-Bonnie and Clyde, Michael J. Pollard, who is also part of the group. Yet another movie. This is like sort of like another path that C.W. Moss could have gone down. Like if he wasn't going to meet Bonnie and Clyde, he would have met these people first. So we've got this really nice, you know, cast in here within this. But at the same time also, one of the things that's also going to get thrown at it is, yeah, it's a cheesy B movie, so it's not like these renowned actors are going to have to do a lot of, like, you know, actors acting in it. People today will watch this and say, oh my god, the acting is so cheesy, or oh, it's so, you know, everything's so bad, it's so cliche, or whatever. But at the particular time, really just like I said, there was something sort of unconventional about the way it was meshing the B movie with the art movie. And that's where the strength of the movie really lies, especially in the way it handles some of the more lively scenes of the movie. Like, for instance, obviously we're on a very low budget. It was made for like under $500,000, I think. But we've got this chase between Dern and the motorcycle cop, which is a surprisingly thrilling scene for the obviously low budget that they have, especially with the way it cuts back and forth. There's one particular moment where we cut back to Dern, and when he's going forward, it almost seems like, it almost looks like one frame, like, slides into another really quickly, to where you can only see if you're, like, really looking, when it keeps cutting back and forth to them. That's always kind of stood out to me and sort of gave that vibe, but of course, of the, you know, moving forward in this chase sequence. But of course, this is eventually where Dern is eventually fatally shot. And so he ends up in the hospital where they break him out, but despite going through this whole thing where they have Nancy Sinatra come in and sort of... This is another case where it might confuse people where they say, oh my god, the acting is so terrible. But there's actually a scene where Nancy Sinatra is sort of... She has to be... Her character has to be convincing enough that she distracts everybody so they can take him, but at the same time, it's almost like she's playing her character as a bad actress when she's doing this. So it's like, I can't tell in this scene if Nancy Sinatra's a bad actress or if she's playing a girl that's a bad actress, but yet it's still convincing enough to make this plan of theirs work. But then, of course, eventually he's... I've heard some people say that it was almost like this was in that era where it almost might have been trying to do an anti-drug thing, where it's, even though he dies from being shot, it's when they try to give him one more hit of weed that he dies. And it was, it was almost like this whole thing, like this reefer madness thing. It's like, oh no, it wasn't the bullets, it was the drugs that killed him. I don't think the movie's saying that. I think that just happened to be the moment that he died. Was getting one last hit in, but still. Then this leads us to the scene that really made this movie stick with me, and I'm assuming is the reason the movie sticks with a lot of people, and that is this funeral scene. And once again, depending on who you are, you can maybe take this in a couple of ways. I only take this funeral scene one way. Like, I was talking about the ending of Easy Rider, it's like, oh, it's this thing, and it's like, maybe this reason's a reach, but, you know, okay, I buy it. I only see this funeral scene one way, and it's not a positive look for them. It's not a party, it's not, you know, giving Loser one last, you know, hurrah outside of his casket, or anything like that. No, not one last party to celebrate his life. Nothing like that either. For me, this funeral scene is like a fucking horror movie. And I feel like that's the intent. Particularly with somebody like Corman with horror roots. Yeah. So, this whole thing, there's just a creepiness to it in general. This imagery of taking Loser out of the casket, setting him up and putting his sunglasses on and the joint in his mouth to make him look alive. And it's just this very still corpse. Weekend at Bernie's, this is not. This is actually like nightmare fuel, where he's just sitting so still and dead while everybody's partying around him. And they've taken the preacher and they've put him in the casket. And then Loser, this guy who was one of them, supposedly one of them, is dead. His body is here being tossed around like a fucking hacky sack. And they rape Diane Ladd. They rape his girl at his funeral. And then Fonda finds somebody also, and it just becomes this whole sort of horrific thing of like and you have this era where it's like there was a point in time where you could glorify, like the, sex and drugs and rock and roll sort of thing. And to an extent, even though it often led to tragedy and death and all that due to excess, there's still not something inherently evil about it. But when you see the combination of those things in this context, it can be horrifying when you go the excess route, because they go sort of beyond the excess route here. And I think this is the point where it's like, if you were debating, you should already know by this point, if you were debating, one of the clues should have been the nurse in the hospital as well. But I mean, if you were debating up to this point if this is a glorification or a condemnation, I think the funeral scene spells it out pretty clearly. But that's sort of the way, the fact that they do play it up as such a celebration for these characters is also what makes it so scary. So, that's the way I always saw that. So, yeah. And then that's pretty much the end of the movie. They take him out and they bury him, but not before they go off and have another, violent reaction to something. Mind you, it was a violent reaction to violence because they were having rocks thrown at them, big rocks. But still, it's like that's always the direction that's going in their life, where like death is constantly interrupted by, sex or violence or whatever. But it's like Loser's body is here and is being buried, and they interrupt this burial to say, oh, we've got to go take care of this, we've got to beat the shit out of them. And it's like they keep thinking that violence or sex or whatever is going to keep distracting them from the fate that Loser is now in. But the fact that the movie lingers on this instead of following them and lingers on Fonda burying him shows that no matter how much they run away from this fate, that's where it ends. So that's the last shot. So that's the way I see it anyway. So, now despite the fact that it may not get as much of a reaction from like regular moviegoers now who may see it as some, shitty B movie or whatever, I was talking about how it's been going to film festivals and getting this sort of reputation, particularly in like the European areas, where it was, at the time, it was made for like less than $500,000. It ended up making $6 million, which gave Corman, like, they gave him like $3 million for his next movie because of the success of this, which was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But the thing that is sort of being shown in these festivals now, and the European audiences are saying that like they're really starting to see how he sort of took the sort of art house techniques and adapted them to make a mainstream movie. And that's how this movie's kind of really stood up, regardless of how other audiences may see it from a different way, a more dated perspective. So, yeah, and then it supposedly got him out of, like, because, as I've been talking about, with the reality of Corman movies, Corman sort of had this, exploitation reputation about him, and The Wild Angels was kind of the movie that was kind of his transition out of it, or at least took the stigmatism out of it. So, yeah, and then took him in a lot of other directions. So, yes. So I think that's what we have here. So obviously I think Easy Rider is always going to kind of be the, well, I would say like the one in all in regards to these biker movies of this era. Obviously the Wild one will be there also. And it's got much more of like a unanimous reputation than something like The Wild Angels. So in a way that that could, in some eyes, make The Wild Angels a much more interesting movie to people. But it is easy to see. I do think there's something about it that, while some people do think it's dated and some people think it's, progressive as far as filmmaking goes, this obviously being able to do that and always kind of have that through most audiences' eyes and kind of have that widespread acknowledgement of, even if the movie feels dated, it's still a time that we love going back to through the vessel of this movie. So I don't know if I specified. If I have a particular preference, I probably prefer Easy Rider. It's one that I revisit more often. Yeah, and it's kind of the one that has, sort of the, I guess, longer legs, but I do think The Wild Angels is not to be ignored in regards to the way people are starting to see it now. So that's how I stand with those. So that's our sort of look at Fonda's movies, or at least these particular ones. So, and this is obviously something that went all the way down to, like, 2007 in particular. Like, the fact that he plays Mephistopheles in Ghost Rider is obviously going to be a reference to this. His cameo at the end of Wild Hogs is obviously a reference to this. With Fonda, it always sort of came back to this. And I do like the way they can sort of spread it out. Like, the way the pictures of Fonda when they announced his death were, like, him next to the bike and saying, like, Easy Rider star, counterculture, whatever. But when you look at somebody like Dennis Hopper, I remember vividly, you could say, like, Blue Velvet star Dennis Hopper, Easy Rider star Dennis Hopper. He had so many sort of big things throughout the industry and so many things he was known for. But I specifically remember the headline when he died was, it didn't do the thing it usually does where it singles out one movie. It just said, Hollywood icon Dennis Hopper, dead at whatever age he was. Yeah, but the fact that Fonda's career was kind of synonymous with these movies, I'm sure is something he took with great pride and passion. So that's where we are with that. So the next thing I'm going to do is the very late review video of the movies that I saw this week. So it's going to be The Peanut Butter Falcon, Blinded by the Light, Where'd You Go, Bernadette, and Loose. So we're basically going to be in indie territory, more or less. So like lower release movies. So maybe I'll see Good Boys at some point, but until then, I think it's going to be these four. So until that, that's it for